Right. So we've heard from Brian about the potential, well, the science of climate change and then the potential impacts of climate change. What I'm going to do today is talk a bit about the impacts of climate change on the UK economy and some work that we've done for DEFRA recently, looking at what the indirect impacts of climate change are on UK business, and then describe some of the work that we're seeing being done in the business community on how they can build resilience to climate change and how they're responding to that climate challenge. But before I do that, I want to get your views on where you think we're going in terms of the development pathway that we're on. And what this chart does is sort of set out in simple terms the current emissions pathway or the development pathway that countries are on. And you've got emissions per capita on the vertical axis, and then GDP per capita on the horizontal. And if you divide the world into 4 quadrants, you know, you've got the industrialized economies in the top right, you know, with high emissions per capita and high GDP per capita. You've got the industrializing economies like China and Korea on the top left, whose GDP per capita is rapidly rising. And then you've got the developing economies on the bottom left, like Ethiopia and India. Now, of course, what we're hoping for, or what we're aiming for, is for all these economies to shift towards a low-carbon pathway. And we describe this as a sort of, you know, do we need a Green Deal, a new Green Deal to achieve this low-carbon economy? So this is one possible trajectory that we may go down. And what this would do is that would avoid breaching the dotted red line there, which sort of represents the total emissions that we can emit to atmosphere to avoid global warming. An alternative pathway is that we keep on going as business as usual, and that climate impacts start to have a significant impact on our economies, and it actually sets our economies back in terms of GDP per capita. So the climate impacts are so severe that it really impacts on people's wealth. And I've called this the sort of catastrophic climate scenario. And then the fourth scenario is rapid response. And this is really where something provokes, some impact of climate change provokes a rapid response from governments and society more broadly. And that forces or allows us to move down towards the low carbon, you know, to be in a sort of a low carbon economy. So I want to just sort of start off by getting your views on which pathway is most realistic. And so I wonder, you know, who amongst you thinks that we're going to just continue on the business as usual pathway and we're going to breach that, the dotted red line, and in fact probably climate change won't be that relevant, and that we'll just continue on that business as usual pathway? Are there any hands there? Okay, there's a couple of shows of hands. Okay, so Brian's got a little bit of work to do. Yeah. What about the second pathway, the new Green Deal? Who thinks that we can shift our economies onto the low carbon pathway rapidly enough? We've got a few more hands. And so, what sort of technologies? Quite a lot of shows of hands. What sort of technologies do you think would allow that? Do you want to give a view? Who wants to give a view? What sort of, you know, are they current technologies? Are they technologies that we still need to develop? Yeah. And what about the third scenario? Do people think that climate impacts will start to have a significant negative impact on wealth, and that it's going to push us backwards? And what sorts of impacts might those be? How might those impacts manifest themselves in particular? Sorry, the lights go out. Yeah. I mean, all these issues are the sorts of things that the business community is starting to deal with. And then the final one, the rapid response, is that, who votes for the rapid response scenario? No, okay, so there aren't that many optimists then here in the room, despite the fact that you're all involved in, you're all part of the solution to this issue. So what I'll do just quickly then is describe the work that we did in our low carbon economy index. And what we're doing is really measuring how rapid the progress is that economies are making towards the low carbon, down this low carbon pathway. And without giving the game away, it's not very rapid. We're basically measuring energy-related emissions for the G20 economy. So we take energy data from BP. We look at GDP data from the World Bank annually, and it's basically dividing one by the other. The dotted grey line there shows that if we can decarbonize, if we'd started decarbonising our economies in 2000, we'd need to decarbonise at about 3.7% per year in order to limit our emissions and keep our emissions to within a 2 degrees carbon budget. So the line, the dotted grey line shows the area under that basically reflects a 2 degrees carbon budget, and it shows how rapidly we need to reduce our emissions in order to stay within that. Now, the progress that we've made to date has been, is shown in the dark red line at the top. And basically, carbon intensity has improved. Emissions per unit of GDP have gone down over the last 12 years or so, but only at about 0.8% per year. This is globally. And so what that means is that the rate of reduction that's now required gets much more rapid in order to stay within that budget. And as the top line extends further across, the rate of change becomes much more rapid, or the required rate of change becomes much more rapid in order to stay within that 2 degrees carbon budget. And so what's required now is a 5.1% reduction in carbon intensity every single year from now to 2050, and in fact beyond that to 2100. In order to stay within the 2 degrees carbon budget. And this has never been achieved since the sort of economic records and energy records began in the 1950s. And so we had a challenge of, well, how do you characterize this as a long-term trend? Can we be definitive in saying, well, it's too late now for 2 degrees, or is it still possible? Now, to put the 5.1 degrees in perspective, in the UK in the 1990s with the dash to gas, the UK economy decarbonised by about 3% per year. In Germany, following reunification and restructuring, the German economy decarbonised by about 3% per year as well. And in France, when they switched to nuclear in the 80s, they achieved a 4% per year reduction in carbon intensity. So it's getting close to what we need to stay within the 2 degrees carbon budget. But we would need those revolutions every year, every decade. And the revolution seen in the UK and the switch to gas was only in one sector. We need equivalent revolutions in every sector, in domestic buildings, in transport, and in industry. And so what we concluded is the government's targets, the government target of 2 degrees, and this is a UN target as well, to limit global warming to 2 degrees. we concluded it was highly unrealistic and that it's time to plan for a warming world. So the next couple of studies that I'll describe to you are some of the analysis that we've done on what those impacts might be. And we're doing some work for DEFRA at the moment, looking at how the impacts of climate change abroad will affect the UK. And there's been quite a lot of work on the direct impacts of climate change on the UK, on the sort of increase in flooding or temperature change. But this was looking at how climate change abroad might affect UK business. And so what we did was we first looked at where do we have an interest abroad, and we looked at the level of trade with other countries. We looked at the concentration of that trade. Where are our troops deployed? Where do we make the most foreign direct investment? Where do we provide the most humanitarian assistance? Where are our British diaspora? So we assessed where are the priority countries in terms of our links. We then looked at the impacts of climate change on those countries. We assessed the vulnerability of those countries, so how adaptable are they to climate change. And then finally, we did some in-depth analysis of particular commodities, such as food or damage to infrastructure. So this map shows a couple of things. The first, it shows the countries highlighted in sort of the darker reds shows where we have the strongest links in terms of trade and diaspora and other things. And this shows it also shows what the impacts of climate change could be, and we focused on agriculture and water availability and extreme weather events. Now, the work that we did for DEFRA, because the government has the view that 2 degrees is the core scenario, we looked at, these are the potential impacts of 2 degrees of change. And there are some positive impacts at 2 degrees, and there are many negative impacts. I think that Brian would probably say that, above 2 degrees and as you approach 4 degrees, most of the impacts become severely negative. So when I first reviewed the work that was being done by our team, my first reaction is, well, why are we looking at 2 degrees? We've already said it's too late for 2 degrees. We should look at what the impacts are at higher degrees of warming than that. And this is the government view. 2 degrees is still a central scenario. So finally, we assessed the adaptive capacity of these countries. So I'll just go back to that. We looked at the adaptive capacity of those countries, and the way we did that was we looked at things like the Human Development Index, governance, and other factors. And more or less what we concluded was slightly sort of simplistic, but it was basically the wealthier a country is, the more adaptable it is. So it slightly follows Peter Lilly's view that, let's just get rich quick and then we'll adapt in 50 years' time. It's obviously more complex than that because richer countries have more expensive infrastructure that is, and when that gets damaged, it obviously has bigger economic impact, and it takes longer to recover from those impacts. In poorer countries, the infrastructure may be less well developed, but it's often there's less capital invested in it, and so recovering from climate impacts may be more straightforward. So it's not adaptive capacity isn't only about wealth. So having done that, we then focused on some particular sectors, and we focused on food and energy in particular. And what we found was that that there is the significant risk of disruption to food and energy commodities. Now in the UK, there's the ability to substitute between these commodities. We didn't think that it was likely that disruption in supply chains was likely to really have an impact on availability of food. or particular commodities in the UK, but it can certainly have an impact on price. And we could sort of foresee much greater commodity price volatility as a result of climate impacts in the future than we see today. And that can have a more significant impact on the poor who will have to bear the burden of that in their shopping basket or in their energy bills, much more so than others. And the same with things like coal and gas and oil. There may be disruption, but the ability to substitute between them means that those energy services will always be available. They're just not necessarily, the prices aren't that stable. So overall, in terms of the sort of threats and opportunities for the UK, there's obviously, one of the big ones is that damage and impacts on British assets abroad or assets that are insured by British companies could have a significant negative impact on the UK business. We think there will be a much greater need for overseas aid and humanitarian assistance. There's likely to be much more volatility in prices. And I think that we concluded that the UK, while the UK government is focused on supporting business in adapting to climate within the UK, there's obviously the need to look at the impacts of climate change abroad as well and consider how that might impact on business in the UK. So what's the business community doing? How's the business community reacting to this? We've worked with a number of companies that are following a very sort of similar methodology to the one that I described on the DEFRA study, where they're basically looking at their supply chains and they're looking at, well, how vulnerable are those supply chains? How resilient are those supply chains? And what impacts will that have on their business? Brian referred to some of these mega trends earlier, and businesses already having to deal with them, with the ever-increasing demand for products by the emerging middle classes. This is putting huge pressure on resources. It's leading to fluctuating commodity prices. And, with the embargo of Russian wheat exports from Russia being an example of how climate change can result in those commodity price fluctuations. But speculation also had an impact on wheat price in 2008, and much of the change in the wheat price in that year was a result of speculation, not just the Russian embargo. And businesses are already quantifying the costs of these climate impacts. So, Del Monte described how, flooding in Guatemala impacted on their banana crop, and they resulted in $4 million of losses. Bunge described how they suffered a $56 million loss from their sugar business due to drought. And flooding in Thailand shut down about a quarter of the country's textile production. So businesses are already dealing with these impacts today. So we worked for a major retailer in the last year or so to try and assess some of these impacts on their operations. And really what we do at PwC is try to quantify those and try to put those in a sort of commercial context. And we've basically followed a similar methodology to what we did with DEFRA and brought a sort of commercial perspective to this. Brian referred to some of the thresholds that we might be approaching on climate. What we found is that some of those thresholds might be related to the viability of particular crops in particular locations. So we know of a chocolate manufacturer whose primary source of cocoa is in Ghana, and the viability of cocoa production in Ghana is threatened by rising temperature in that region. They have very concentrated supply chain, and they recognise they need to engage with cocoa producers to ensure that they're more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Similarly, with infrastructure, some of those thresholds might be in the viability of infrastructure above certain levels. So if you have extreme heat events, that might cause huge damage to road infrastructure, and I think we've seen that already in the UK, where road infrastructure can get degraded quite quickly after a few weeks of extreme heat. And what we see businesses are doing is, they're reacting in quite different ways to these challenges. Some are focusing on efficiency and maximising their resource efficiency and their energy efficiency. This brings the dividend of lower costs and some resilience to the threat of price volatility. Others are looking more at how they can build resilience to disruptive events, flooding, how they can manage they're looking at the vulnerability of particular pinch points in their operations. So a distribution hub, is that vulnerable to extreme weather events or flooding? How resilient is their workforce? Are their workforce able to move around and get to their place of work very easily? During Hurricane Sandy last year, about 10,000 of PwC staff were unable to get to the office for a period of a couple of weeks because of the disruption caused by that event. And we had to do a huge amount of planning to be able to respond to that. We're able to do a lot of the work remotely, but much of the work we have to do is on client sites. And so this had an immediate impact on our business. So PwC is doing lots of planning around how do we respond to these disruptive events. Others are looking beyond their borders. They're looking much further down their supply chains to assess their vulnerability along their supply chains. And all of them are sort of anticipating resource constraints. So I want to finish by coming back to our low carbon economy index and think about some of the slides that Brian presented as well on what the potential impacts might be. And what's fairly clear is that we can anticipate some climate shocks, and businesses are preparing for those. But there's also the prospect of climate policy shocks as well, and a sort of a knee-jerk policy response to climate change, where there might be the sudden imposition of new standards or new costs imposed on businesses which threaten the viability of those businesses or strand major assets. Currently, the price of an EU carbon allowance is around €4.22, and so that price has very little impact on how businesses go about their daily operations. It doesn't have an impact very much on the power price at all. It has been up above 30, and what the IEA has suggested is it would need to be much closer to $100 per tonne if we're to shift businesses down that low carbon pathway that I talked about. So that sort of knee-jerk reaction, or a knee-jerk policy reaction to climate change, is something that is possible if the impacts of climate change force or bring about the political will to deal with the situation. And I guess to end on a slightly more upbeat note, we are seeing that many businesses are preparing for those impacts, and many businesses that you're dealing with are responding in a way that's much more sort of constructive than much of what we're seeing at the UN. And so, it's great to be at an event like this where we're seeing the sharing of knowledge around low carbon technologies and low carbon implementation plans, because this is the direction that many businesses will need to go in order to be able to respond to or build their resilience to climate change. Thanks very much.